So now we've registered our LTI application, and the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and clone our project so that we can get started. And so the first thing we need to do is navigate to github.com/blackboard/bbdn-uef-python. Now, you don't have to remember that or type it in manually. It's linked to from this course. But I wanted to just take a second to go over a little bit about this project. So a number of things to keep in mind. Number one, as I mentioned, we are using Python and we're using the Flask framework to allow us to use a number of built-in properties of that library that allow us to quite easily create endpoints and then serve HTML files. With Flask, by default, you get a WSGI engine that is meant for using as a development process. I went ahead and used Gunicorn. Essentially, this is a production level WSGI server, and it allows you to configure a number of things, including the number of workers and the number of processors that you're allocating. Pretty much overkill for this particular project, but I like to use it just because it does create a more production-ready environment, so that if you were to use this as the basis for something that you want to build, that would already be done for you. So everything really lives within the app. So here's our static files and our template files, and you can see we have a couple of templates set up for our configuration, and we'll need to create another file called private.key based on what we received from our registration of our application. So without further ado, let me go back to the top level here. And so what you're going to do, you'll need to have Git installed, and if you Google Git installation, if you don't already have it, it's pretty easy to do. But here under code we have this link, and essentially all you have to do is copy this link and then go to a terminal in the directory that you choose and type git space clone space and then paste this link and hit enter, and it will download all of this stuff for you, and you will be ready to get started. So let me switch over to a terminal, and I've already done this, so let me clear my screen, and just to show, we'll say git space clone, and then I will grab my URL and paste it here, and it just takes a few seconds. It pulls everything down. If I were to do a list, you would see we have bbdn-uf-python, and so if we go into that directory, you will see all of our files. So let me pull this up in VS Code, and of course you can use anything that you like for this. But here you can see that we have our UEF tutorial, bbdn-uef-python. You can see we have our app file, and we have our Docker file, and our Gunicorn config file, and our README, and all that fun stuff. So what you're going to want to do is go ahead and in this app file, you'll see that there's the config.template.py. And so if we click on it, you can see this is what you would have downloaded. So basically you want to copy this and paste it into that app directory and call it config.py with a capital C. It is case sensitive, and it will not work if you do not give it the capital C. And essentially what we're going to do is we need to fill in the learn URL, the rest key, the rest secret, and my URL. So if we look at my config.py, you'll see here I'm using the devcon.blackboard.com server. Here we have my learn rest key. So if I come back here to where I've registered my application, here's my key, here's my secret. So you can simply copy here and paste here your key and your secret. And then the app URL is the top level of your application. And so this is essentially our ngrok that we've already seen once. And you can just come here and copy this and paste it in here and save it, and now your application is configured to use REST. The next step is to configure our LTI connection. And so here you can see we have our LTI template. And again, we'll need to copy this, paste it into the app directory, and rename it to lti.json. And again, the casing matters, and it must be all lowercase. And then we're going to, essentially, we only have two things to fill in right now. Our client ID in two places. And so if we look at our lti.json, you can see we have our client ID here. You can see we also have the client ID here. And so again, if I click over to where we've registered, you can see our application ID, which is our client ID. And so all you have to do is copy it here and paste it here. Now this deployment ID we'll get to in a second, because the next thing that we're going to do is register our application within the Blackboard Learn instance. And when we do that, we'll get a deployment ID that's dynamically created. Now you don't have to use deployment IDs, but it is a way to make sure, number one, that your application is receiving a launch from the appropriate deployment ID from Learn. Number two, in this particular library that we're using for LTI, you can actually have an array here. And so you could have a number of deployments, and you could use that deployment ID to differentiate between multiple systems that are hitting your application. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to create a file called private key. This does not exist, and I did not create a template because it's always the same name. So basically we just create a file called private key, and then once again we head back to our registration, we copy this private key, and we paste it and save it. And now we are all configured and ready to go on to the next step, which is to register our application within the Learn instance. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you in a minute.